Hello and welcome back. We are continuing our coverage on the latest developments between the United States and Cuba, releasing Alan Gross back to the United States. President Obama did announce earlier today plans to really normalize the diplomatic relations with Cuba and ease economic restrictions on that nation. And now Alan Gross is back home in the United States after spending 5 years in a Cuban prison.
Yes, and I know we promised you that we would have coverage of him speaking, and we're still waiting on that. But while we wait, we'll give you just a little bit of a recap of what has been taking place this morning. At noon, President Obama spoke on some of the changes that will be happening. Now, we know that 2 Americans, including Alan Gross, were released this morning. The other American not named for security reasons because he was actually one of the people who informed the U.S. of information that led to the arrest of the Cuban spies that were found here in Florida. And now 3 of them were also released today in exchange for the 2 Americans. The other 2, as part of that group of 5 spies, had already been released as they finished up their sentences. But, you know, as we continue to wait on Mr. Gross, I know that he has been able to speak with his family a few times and see them. They've said that his condition, as far as health is concerned, has been declining throughout these 5 years. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, what kind of state he's in when he speaks.
We've seen some of those before and after pictures of him just recently and before he went into the Cuban prison, and you can tell he lost a substantial amount of weight over these last few years. So hopefully he can get the help that he's needed to get treated and back up to feeling great again. And going back to what President Obama said, he's also instructed Secretary of State John Kerry to start discussions with Cuba to reestablish those diplomatic relations, talking about having a U.S. embassy in Havana and then as well as an embassy in Washington as well. So that is just really a historic time in the U.S. and Cuba right now.
And in addition to that, he also said Cuba will join the Summit of the Americas in April.
Let's go ahead and cut in right now to see what's going on. We know that Alan Gross should be speaking momentarily.
Alan walks in, gives his statement. I believe it's 5 to 7 minutes, maybe a little longer, a little shorter. He's going to then leave. There will be no questions. After a minute or so, we will close down shop. So.
And when are you expecting to go?
I'm hoping in the next 5 to 7 minutes. They're just
okay, and again, we are just getting ready to hear from Alan Gross right off the plane. You can only imagine what he's feeling right now to finally be back home in the U.S. You have to think if he ever really thought this day would come, just how happy he's got to be, and his family as well.
Yeah. All right. Now, I know, everybody has an opinion about what these policy changes are going to mean. Many of those people, senators from right here in Florida, including Marco Rubio, who after hearing President Obama speak, it was very apparent that he disagreed with some of these changes. And here's what he had to say.
This entire policy shift announced today is based on an illusion, on a lie. The lie and the illusion that more commerce and access to money and goods will translate to political freedom for the Cuban people. All this is going to do is give the Castro regime, which controls every aspect of Cuban life, the opportunity to manipulate these changes.
Right, and now President Obama, what he's referring to, President Obama said earlier in his noon speech that, Americans will be able to have more unrestricted travel between the U.S. and Cuba and the U.S. So that's going to mean a lot, especially for the Cuban Americans right here in Florida. But in addition to that, they're going to be freeing up commerce and things like being able to use American credit cards and debit cards while traveling. Here's a little bit more about what President Obama had to say.
Having recovered these 2 men who sacrificed for our country, I'm now taking steps to place the interests of the people of both countries at the heart of our policy. First, I've instructed Secretary Kerry to immediately begin discussions with Cuba to reestablish diplomatic relations that have been severed since January of 1961. Going forward, the United States will reestablish an embassy in Havana, and high-ranking officials will visit Cuba. Where we can advance shared interests, we will, on issues like health, migration, counterterrorism, drug trafficking, and disaster response.
All right, now, Senator Bill Nelson also, someone caught up with him later today, and he actually agreed with Obama and had a lot of good things to say about what some of these policy changes could mean. Here's what he thinks.
Once you get a free and democratic Cuba, where people are free to express themselves and free to come and go, you're going to have an economic renaissance between the United States and Cuba, and especially between Florida and Cuba.
And Florida Governor Rick Scott and former Governor Jeb Bush also weighed in on this issue earlier today, just really expressing their excitement for Alan Gross and his family. Here's what they had to say.
Oh, it's exciting. It's exciting that he's heading home. Unfortunately, Cuba is still a totalitarian state and still causing civil unrest in Venezuela, but that's great that Alan Gross is coming home.
It's a tragedy that he had to be in prison that long for simply doing his job. But the fact is that he's coming home, and that's great news.
Yeah, we talk about Gross was arrested in Cuba after traveling under a program under the U.S. Agency, actually, for International Development. And just, it's tough to see what he's had to go through these last few years. He was initially sentenced to 15 years in prison. Obviously, very glad to have him back in the U.S.
Yes, and you know, this just means a lot for the U.S. and Cuba. I mean, talk about what he's been through, what these countries have been through. I mean, President Obama talked about the 50 years of isolation and says, you know, that wasn't working. Those policies for prevention of travel and commerce have had little effect on helping either country, really. He compared it to the 35 years of relations with communist China and how we have been able to work with them and not have that isolation. So it seems as though that's something that we're going to be shifting back to this very historic day.
Absolutely. And at the same time, both President Obama and President Raul Castro gave a lot of credit to the Pope Francis, who had really been a go-between the both of them to really get something figured out, getting Alan Gross back home. And I know both of them in their speeches today did mention Pope Francis and what he has done to really get those relations, at least to get Alan Gross back home.
And I know we're still waiting for Alan Gross to speak, and just, you know, something we haven't mentioned, just how he actually got to this point. You know, he was arrested 5 years ago in Cuba because he was working for USAID, a democracy group that was actually installing internet in parts of Cuba, and the Cubans considered that to be like a breach of their law. So, you know, just disagreements, obviously, in how things should be done in both of these countries have been a major issue, and this is what it's led to, so.
Yeah, he was simply there, again, as you said, helping with some of the internet and just different communications to a group of the island's Jewish population. And just in 2011, arrested and imprisoned, like we said, initially for 15 years. So certainly after 5 years, still way too long, and glad to have him back in the U.S.
And you have to wonder, you know, what is this going to mean for Cuban Americans? I mean, being here in Florida, it's going to be interesting to see the impact of this and how this is going to affect them. Being able to travel, being able to send money to their families. Those are some of the things that President Obama said they will now be able to do. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, we've seen reports already so far that some of the older Cuban Americans that are here in the U.S. Tend to maybe not necessarily agree with President Obama and some of these changes that he's proposing, where some of the younger Cuban Americans are on board with that. So there is a difference in even what some of them are really believing right now. So that'll be interesting to follow. But what a historic day, finally getting Alan Gross back home in the U.S.
And we will actually be able to hear from a little bit later today in our afternoon shows some people who have a direct tie to Cuba and their families. I know one of the reporters over at the Herald Tribune has a direct connection to Cuba. He'll be here later today to speak about that. So it's going to be interesting to see just what happens.
I think we all really do want to hear what Alan has to say.
Your forecast coming up in just a little bit. For now, back to you ladies.
All right, thanks, Kathy. And we are still awaiting to hear from Alan Gross, who is speaking momentarily from what we do understand. Again, they were just prepping some of the reporters here. We expected to speak about 5 to 7 minutes, they said. And certainly you can just imagine what this is. Honestly, I can't even imagine what this would be like for him, just to be back here. Safe, and obviously I think a priority is just getting him back up to good health.
And being able to see his family, I'm sure right now is also a priority. There's no telling why we're having to wait right now, but I can only imagine that he's just so happy to be able to see them, and
Yeah.
they're, you know, hoping that he can now recover from this.
Yeah, and just I did see a picture earlier today of Alan standing with his wife, and you know that's just got to be the greatest feeling for both of them to be able to hold each other and just to be back there.
And because it's been 5 years that he has been in a prison in Cuba, it's been said that he's lost, you know, almost 100 pounds.
Yeah.
So.
Certainly getting him back up to good health is a priority right now. Again, we are awaiting that press conference with Alan, but for right now, please stay with SNN. We are going to take a very short break, but stay with us here on the Suncoast News Network. Welcome back to SNN. We are covering our developing story. Alan Gross, held in a Cuban prison for 5 years, now back at home in the United States. We are awaiting a press conference where he is expected to be speaking. Just an historic day back in the U.S. He's speaking momentarily.
Yeah, historic day for him, historic day for the country. As you see, we're still looking at that podium, awaiting for him to come up and hear what he has to say. There's no telling what he has to say. He's been in prison for 5 years in Cuba, had health problems, hasn't been able to see his family very much, and from what we've heard, you know, his health has been declining. So it's going to be interesting. There he is with some members of his family. So.
And so glad to have him back here. And we also know President Obama has already earlier today did announce plans to really just normalize some of the relations with Cuba, ease some of those economic restrictions on the nation. This is something that obviously, like many issues in the U.S. right now, some people agree with, others do not. We've heard from Senator Marco Rubio, who has disagreed with some of these stances that the president has taken. But right now, is still just a historic time for the U.S. and Cuba.
Senator Bill Nelson, of course, on the other side of that was in agreement, thought that it was a great idea. It's going to be great for the Cuban Americans in the country and just, you know, people, anybody who wants to be able to travel to Cuba. I mentioned a minute ago that we're going to have some more people that have direct ties to Cuba coming on later. Actually, Carrie Seidman with the Herald Tribune, we're expecting to be able to hear from her. She just recently made a trip down to Cuba for a special report. So she has seen, you know, everything that's going on there.
Yep, she's seen it firsthand. So you will want to stay with SNN throughout the evening to see our continuing coverage on this. In the meantime, again, we are waiting to hear from Alan Gross. You can only imagine what it's like for him. We saw the pictures of him coming off the plane earlier. Just the feeling, you know, and I saw reports that he had actually called his children and just said, the first thing he said was, "I'm free." And that really just explains it all. He is free, he is back home.
Wow, what a statement. I mean, for today, I'm free.
I'm free, yeah.
Have to wonder,
After
you know.
5 years, yeah, certainly. And again, you were seeing pictures of Alan. So back at home, again, we've talked about his health. It has declined. He has lost, as we've said, about 100 pounds over that time.
I mean, that's amazing, 100 pounds, and how he's still here with us. But, you know, he wasn't the only one released today. President Obama said there was actually another American that was released. Of course, they did not release the identity of that man because he was actually one of the informants that was able to provide information to the U.S. on some of the spies that were captured and actually being held here until 3 of them until today as part of that agreement. Those 3 are being sent back to Cuba in exchange for the 2 Americans, and along with it, so many changes for policy. So, you know, things like, you know, more free commerce between the 2 and travel, just a lot of changes ahead.
A lot, and this is certainly a continuing story. We're looking at some pictures right now. You see some of the signs. Free Alan Gross now. Obviously, he is free. And you can just, he's got a lot of supporters out there that are just very excited to see that he is home. We did hear from Florida Governor Rick Scott before and former Governor Jeb Bush, just both saying how excited they were to have him back here on U.S. soil. And just to recap and tell you what happened, Gross was arrested after traveling. It was under a U.S. agency for.
To talk
let's go ahead and listen in on this press conference.
But I wanted to just give you a little bit of background.
And we are continuing to follow our developing story. Right now, we are awaiting Alan Gross, who is expected to speak to the media after being released. Spent 5 years in a Cuban prison. We do want to also mention, we did talk about President Obama proposing and announcing some changes in the relations between U.S. and Cuba. We do want to clarify the embargo still in place. And that's a congressional, more so decision, but it'll be interesting to see what happens coming into starting next year when obviously Republicans do take over the Senate and House, so or remain control in the House. So that will also be something else to look forward to.
Yeah, very interesting with all the things that we have going on here with our Congress, how that's going to play into this, being that it requires action from them.
And we did hear from President Obama earlier on this as well.
At noon, he spoke about some of those things that we were just saying that would require that action, including more free commerce between the two countries, being able to use money, being able to send money, and then travel, the ability to travel between the two, less restrictions on that. Here's what he had to say.
Having recovered these two men who sacrificed for our country, I'm now taking steps to place the interests of the people of both countries at the heart of our policy. First, I've instructed Secretary Kerry to immediately begin discussions with Cuba to reestablish diplomatic relations that have been severed since January of 1961. Going forward, the United States will reestablish an embassy in Havana, and high-ranking officials will visit Cuba. Where we can advance shared interests, we will, on issues like health, migration, counterterrorism, drug trafficking, and disaster response.
All right, and you know, we were talking about how everybody has an opinion on this, and not everyone seems to agree with the president. Senator Rubio was one of those people who shared his thoughts not long after Obama spoke and his disagreement with what is happening today.
This entire policy shift announced today is based on an illusion, on a lie. The lie and the illusion that more commerce and access to money and goods will translate to political freedom for the Cuban people. All this is going to do is give the Castro regime, which controls every aspect of Cuban life.
All right, and now we are awaiting to hear from Alan Gross. Let's go ahead and send you right to his press conference.
Yeah. I have to say Chag Sameach and happy holiday season to all of you. Today is the first day of Hanukkah, and I guess so far it's the best Hanukkah that I'll be celebrating for a long time. But for now, I'll close with a quote from one of Nelson DeMille's character. It's good to be home. Thank you, and I wish you all a happy holiday season. Thank you.
What are your wishes?
Good to be home. That's what you hear from Alan Gross back in the U.S., just speaking to the U.S. media for the first time. You can tell just the look on his face, the way he spoke. He is so thrilled to be back home, understandably. 5 years held in a Cuban prison. So thankful. Thanked everyone for their efforts, including President Obama and several of the members of Congress. You could just see the joy on his face.
And another thing I thought was very interesting that he mentioned, he brought up the people of Cuba when he was talking. And he said, you know, in no way are they responsible for what happened to him. And if anything, he grew closer to them. He says they're kind, generous people, and he hates to see them suffer because of the relationship that they have with their government and the relationship between these two governments.
Yeah. He said it pains them, or pains him to see what they're going through and treated just so unjustly. So that was great to hear from him. And he even, we heard beforehand from a family spokesperson that he had trouble with his teeth. You never know how someone's going to react to that, but clearly he does still have a sense of humor, able to make a little joke in there about speaking more once he gets his
new teeth.
Yeah, his new teeth and all of that situated. So that's great to see. And you can just tell that he is ready to spend time with his family, asking for privacy at this time. But it's so special to see and the joy on his face.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear from him. So right now we're going to shift gears and take a look at our weather. Meteorologist Cassie Knoll is waiting in our weather center.
All right, thanks, Cassie. And certainly you will want to stay with SNN. We do have continuing coverage on this, including hearing from Carrie Seidman from the Herald Tribune, Michael Braga, and Jeremy Wallace as well.
Yes, they are all going to have a lot to say about this. Some of them even have connections to Cuba.
Yep,
So
absolutely. So stay with us here on the Suncoast News Network.